So when I first came to Living Opportunities, we did two things. We did group homes. We only had three. We had Beatty Street, Edward Street, which no longer exists, neither one of them exists today, and Stonehouse on Roberts Road. And we had about 28 people living in three houses, which is pretty typical. When folks first moved out of institutions, again, no track record in communities, and the state's looking at it going, can we afford to do this? So the typical group home in the beginning was 10 to 15 people in a 4-bedroom house, which, I mean, think about that for a minute. 15 people in a 4-bedroom house. That makes things a little unlivable, to say the least. So over time, what's happened is we've kind of moved to what I would say we've moved toward the one. So we've moved from 10 to 15 people in a house and thinking about that as a cost unit to thinking about the person and what the person wants and where the person wants to live or work. So it's a big shift in thinking, big shift in terms of support strategies, big shift in terms of money over time. But in the beginning, we had three houses, about 28 people living there. We had a sheltered workshop. We had been attempting to, my predecessors had been attempting to change that and get some jobs in the community. But for the most part, we had a shelter workshop. About half the people were working in it because we didn't have a lot of work, but it was mostly assembly and packaging work, things that you could bring in from companies from the outside. And there were about 35, 40 people working in that situation. So over time, again, I came in specifically initially to develop jobs. So that was the very first push, and just kind of helping people change their thinking, changing their expectations a little bit, beginning to really think about it, not so much as, the touchy-feely nonprofit, but more like a business, talking business language, having business titles, and having business-like practices from that point forward. And we slowly began to make that change. The first things we did were crews and what were called enclaves. An enclave is basically a group of people embedded inside a business with a job coach or two, and then they do work from there. Derek's Enterprises for a long time had an enclave. We had an enclave at what was then called Gold River Distributing. We had 2 or 3 of those. We also had mobile crews, we had yard crews. I think we still have those. Janitorial crews. That was some of the very first supported employment. And part of it is those jobs were a little bit easier to find than individual placements because in a way it was still kind of quasi the shelter workshop model, where the business was kind of giving us their business, even in an enclave setting, giving us their business, and then we'd take care of what happened inside that little enclave, and it would go back out to the business. But the big difference was people with disabilities had physical access, social access to the people in that business, so relationships could begin to develop, and so it was a big step in that regard. And then from there, of course, individual placements starting in about 1994. We began to get much better at individual placements, and that's been our focus of the organization ever since, the primary focus. For living situations, it was a bit the same. Our first idea was, wow, having 28 people in 3 houses, that's a lot of people per house. So the first idea was expanding the number of houses and reducing the number of people so that the people that lived there would have a more livable situation. And then we already had, thanks to the forward thinking of the people who ran the organization before me and the board of directors, we already had the precursor of a supported living service. It was called semi-independent living. Some of the rules at that point in time, a person had to be able to be on their own completely without any staff contact for 3 days at a time. They had to be completely independent in terms of cooking meals and delivering medications. And because our strategies at that point in time weren't good enough to support people that had skill deficits in those areas. So over time, what we did was we added a couple of houses, but what we really began to grow was the semi-independent living service, which is now called supported living. And what happened as we began making those individual placements and expanding supported living is, as it turns out, those were more attractive options typically for people. So there was a demand. It's kind of like the typical marketplace. If you have the fanciest shoes, or you have the only access to the only shoes of that type in your community, and they become popular, folks want those shoes and they'll come to you. And I think that's what happened with us, is that we began really developing a reputation that we could develop jobs for people in regular businesses, and that we could do a good job of that. We improved our relationships with employers, improved our business practices, improved our support strategies, and we got very successful over time at doing that. I think the same thing can be said for supported living. We got very good at expanding our strategies, figuring out ways to help people that had pretty significant skill deficits be safe, healthy, and happy in a more independent setting. And what that did was really get people to the point where they could make choices that they couldn't make before. There's a lot of talk about choice in our line of work, but the truth is that choosing between two bad options is still choosing between two bad options. I think we were providing options that people really wanted, and it opened up the kinds of choices that they could make. So now, for example, if they chose to live in an apartment, well, there were a whole lot of other choices that were connected to that. Where was the apartment going to be? What was it going to look like? Who were they going to live with? So a whole lot of choices that weren't available in prior settings were available when people began to move into apartment settings. Same is true for work. And I think because of that, well, think about choice for a minute. What is choice? Choice is control. Choice is control over your life. We're talking about people, if you go back to state institutions, had no control whatsoever. They had no control where they lived, who they lived with, what they ate every day. They ate in the cafeteria, whatever was available. No choices at all. To a time where people could make significant choices that impacted their lives. And I think part of our responsibility in that process is to help people learn how to make choices. Because again, we're still serving people that lived in institutions. Matt's a good example of that. We're still serving people that came out of that situation where everything was controlled in their lives. And now, we're asking them to make choices sometimes without enough practice. So we've got to remember, I think, as an organization, that part of our responsibility is to help people learn and get practice at making those kinds of choices. Over the course of time, I mean, one of the things that we did was kind of stick to the knitting. And that was intentional. There were a lot of organizations that were kind of boutiquing what they did, so they might develop a school or do different types of services, or consider supported employment as just one in an array of things that they did. We really focused on supported living, especially in 24-hour support in group homes and employment. And our goal, the innovative things I think that we did, stayed within a fairly small framework. And frankly, I think that's part of the reason for our success, is we got really, really good at those things instead of kind of boutiquing things, doing lots of different things and not being so great at any of them. So there was an intentional kind of keeping some boundaries around what we did in terms of the types of services and also geography. We very intentionally stayed in Jackson County. Again, those decisions might change as strategies change, as technology changes. It might make it easier to go to other communities to replicate the kinds of work that we do. But in the early days, most of the time I was here, we didn't have that kind of technology. And it's difficult to operate kind of franchised services in another community. You've got to if you want to maintain the quality of it. So really, from a quality standpoint, we made the intentional decision to stay in Jackson County and to keep our services within certain boundaries and then innovate within those boundaries and get really good at those kinds of services. We added a couple of things to that array. We had two kinds of residential services, group homes and supported living and employment, and then we added consultation. And one of the reasons the primary reason that we added consultation was interest from outside the community to have us come there and replicate what we were doing. So we were gaining a reputation in Josephine County and Coos County and in Douglas County for the kinds of services that we were providing, and they wanted us to come there and do that. And we thought, well, we're not confident we can keep the quality up if we go to services at a distance. But what we can do is put together a consulting arm of the organization. And the original idea of the consulting arm was that we'd start out with behavioral consultation and kind of teaching supports because there was a demand right then and there for that. But the business plan always was that we were going to move to both supported living and supported employment at some point in time because we thought that there would be a demand for that the way services were moving from large congregate care services to very individualized services, and our practice and innovation within those services, our business assumption was that there would be a demand on the outside. So far, there hasn't been a demand for supported living, but I think that's going to change. I think there is now a demand for employment, and in fact, we're doing consultation now all over the state. We're recognized beyond the boundaries of the state of Oregon for the types of employment that we've been able to support and develop over time. And there is demand for what we know, and other organizations want to learn how to do that.